Thanks very much indeed, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you for your warm welcome. I think we have many shared issues together, but I want to say a little bit about the situation in Britain, but also how it applies globally too. I can say that since Trump entered the White House, there has been a new phenomenon in the British media. They routinely now talk about the danger of World War III. Last year it was because of North Korea and the Iran nuclear deal, and last week it was about the United States and then Russia pulling out of the INF treaty. Maybe World War III is an exaggeration for the time being, but there is no doubt that nuclear weapons, and in particular changing policies about nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons, present an existential threat. And perhaps alongside climate change, it is the greatest existential threat. So amongst these issues, I can say that currently our campaigning is focusing very much about the problem of the potential end of the INF treaty. I'm sure that, like many of you here, in the 1980s, we struggled very hard to get rid of, or to prevent and then get rid of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe. And the INF treaty itself was, at least in part, a victory of the peace movement across the continent in putting an end to that whole class of nuclear weapons. By 1991, all those weapons were removed from Europe. And it's absolutely clear there is a danger with the ending of the treaty that those weapons will be reintroduced into Europe. And that is certainly a strong focus of our current campaigning in Britain. And as a result, we have very many new members who also share our concern. But I think we also recognise now that this is not just going to be a European problem as it was in the 1980s. There is also the danger that these weapons will be situated by the United States in Japan. There are other bases in East Asia, Okinawa, for example, so they can be part of the US confrontation against China. So it's a kind of global expansion, potentially, of the sighting and potential use of the intermediate range nuclear weapons. Alongside the threat to the INF, we also see a threat to the New START treaty, the bilateral reductions between the US and Russia. And now there is a possibility that they will not find ways to continue the treaty and continue the reductions. And while Bolton is there in the White House alongside Trump, the idea that we will have any positive new treaties, any arms control, I think we have to forget that, because Bolton is absolutely committed to getting rid of all these treaties which restrain the United States and its nuclear weaponry. But of course, it's not just the United States and it's not just Russia. It's all nuclear weapons states are engaging in nuclear modernization. And of course, potential modernization now across Europe of NATO's nuclear weapons here too. In Britain, our campaigning focuses against the replacement of the Trident nuclear weapons system. This is Britain's so-called independent nuclear deterrent. The replacement will cost over £205 billion. And there is the majority of the population in Britain that opposes this, because the money that is being spent on useless and dangerous nuclear weapons could be so much better spent on our health service, on jobs, on dealing with the climate, on housing, and so on. So this is a very sharp social question, as well as being a question of peace and disarmament. But particularly terrifying, I think, are the changes that are taking place in policy around nuclear weapons. For many decades, it was always said, we're not actually going to use them. They're just there to stop other people using them. In fact, British politicians have said, we have them in order not to use them, which is crazy. You could just not have them. But now that discussion, that way of justifying nuclear weapons is also ending. And the talk of usable nuclear weapons is coming back onto the agenda. Last year, you will have seen the US Nuclear Posture Review, which talked about building usable nuclear weapons, which they described as low yield. Now, in today's parlance, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are low-yield nuclear weapons. So we're not talking about something tiny that you can drop without being a problem. This is very, very serious, and the talk of using nuclear weapons is a very, very bad development. And if you take this alongside the US Strategic Defence Review last year, where they talked about their strategic approach to the world and to defence and military policy, you'll remember that they talked about their reorientation now towards Russia and China. Previously, the policies were about the war on terror, the Middle East. The war on terror is now put to one side, and it is all now about orientation towards competing and kind of pushing down their strategic competitors, which are Russia and China. So this whole orientation, if they now have a usable nukes policy and an orientation towards pushing down two massive nuclear weapon states, Russia and China, you can see how much more dangerous the US policies now are. So, of course, it's not just the nuclear issues that we're concerned with. Climate, which the previous colleague spoke of, that's also very important. And in Britain, just at the moment, this week and next week, there are huge climate protests by school children. Okay, they've decided, what's the point of learning all these things in schools if they don't have a future because of climate change? And now they are having school strikes across the country. So this is a very important development, young people engaging in these protests. And the CND contribution, my campaign's contribution, is in particular to oppose nuclear power, which our own government is still supporting, to oppose nuclear power and to campaign for for renewable energies that are so abundant. But we also have other military areas of campaigning which are newly developing around the new technologies which are entering into both civil and military areas. So cyber warfare, for example, that's something that we have to address. Artificial intelligence, particularly drones and remote killing, all those kinds of issues are key problems for us. Even the sabotage of the Internet of Things. These are all questions, because something that may mean we can turn our fridge on and off when we're out at work or something like that, those kinds of applications. Think how useful those will be for the military. So all these things that are new technology for our homes and presented as such are also military applications as well. There's a new area too, which we're beginning to be concerned about, which was actually highlighted last month by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists when they announced their doomsday clock, 2 minutes to midnight. And they talked about what they call the information war, and they talk about our political leaders who lie shamefully, who use propaganda, false propaganda, and they call truth fake news and vice versa. And they even talk now about post-truth politics. And this whole misinformation, propaganda, lies, and contempt for the truth is also something that is a serious matter, not only in social and political terms, but also military terms too. And what the scientists say is that the trashing or destruction of reason and civilized discourse will undermine our ability to acknowledge and address the urgent threats posed by nuclear weapons. All the lies and fake news going on obscures the real threats that we face. So it's really important that we take this on board too in our campaigning. So I suppose one of the things we're trying to address in Britain is how do we get more engagement? How do we get people to understand the real dangers of nuclear weapons? And I suppose because they've been dangerous for such a long time, but they haven't been used since 1945, there's a bit of a feeling, yes, they are very dangerous, but actually they're not going to be used. We have to try and break down that misunderstanding. But there are many things which prevent popular engagement with these crucial questions. Proper issues, obviously, like where can people find a job? Can they find work? Can they manage financially? These things stop people engaging. But I have to say, in Britain at the moment, it's very difficult to discuss anything other than Brexit. On the news the whole time, in the newspapers, Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. And it's hard to get politicians to engage. We have the INF Treaty being destroyed, but in Parliament they only want to talk about Brexit. They need to talk about it because Brexit will be disastrous for the United Kingdom. And this is one thing. In the peace movement, we want to be united. We don't want to be divided over how we feel about Brexit and those questions. But we have to recognise that it is very serious. It's serious for our economy, for our society, and for politics. It's been driven by a far-right agenda. This is one of the things. Many of us are very critical of the EU, the neoliberal nature of the EU, but we recognise that the referendum arose because our Prime Minister wanted to make concessions to the far right in his party and outside of it. So it's been driven by a far right agenda. But we recognise that in particular the loss of the right to free movement of people across Europe is a huge blow for ordinary people. And it's a huge blow to the principle of solidarity amongst peoples across borders, not peoples on the basis of national identity. So this is a big problem. And also, of course, it can contribute, these political tendencies can contribute to conflict between countries. We've seen the conflict at the moment between France and Italy in the context of the rise of the far right in Italy. So these are all issues that we need to be aware of. We recognise that in Britain, the majority of trade unionists, the majority of the Labour Party, and the majority of working class voters all voted to remain in the European Union. And overwhelmingly young people voted to remain in the European Union, not uncritically, but because there is a potential for a better future, better solidarity across Europe if we remain within the European Union. Currently, there is a strong campaign for what's called a people's vote, that there's another vote on what kind of Brexit we should have. Some people want another should we remain or not vote on that ballot paper, but our government doesn't support it. It's a very divisive issue in the Conservative Party. Opinion polls show, in fact, that the balance of opinion in the country has shifted away from leave, and that it is now 54% to 46% in favour of remain. But either way, whatever happens, there is going to be huge tension and conflict remaining around this issue in the country. Labour is now proposing policies whereby it would support a Tory-led Brexit by Mrs May. They're campaigning to get union rights enshrined in law, that we should be part of a customs union. But the outcome is unknown. And there are many on the left and in the Labour Party who would prefer Labour to push for a general election rather than find a way of supporting a Brexit led by Mrs May. So you can imagine it's a big conflictual issue on the left, and we have to work hard to prevent it being a conflictual issue within the peace movement. So to conclude, we have a lot to engage us in our work. We have the challenge of the far right and increasing nationalisms. We have the anti-NATO work. And of course, in this December now, we've heard that the NATO summit, the Heads of State summit, will now be in London in December. Trump will be coming to London as well, so there'll be a huge opportunity for a big mobilisation, not just around NATO, but around all the social and political issues. So that's very important for us. It's a big opportunity for the No to War, No to NATO network as well, coming to London. We also have the challenge of increasing militarisation of Europe, and can I congratulate you on your Disarm Now initiative and building such strong support. That's a very important development. And above all, Chair, to conclude, I stress the importance of us working together across our communities, inclusively and across the issues, but also internationally as well. None of the problems that we face can be solved on a national basis. These problems can only be solved on an international basis. And I look forward to working with you in unity and in action over the coming months and years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.